Welcome back, everyone. Well, it's been quite a while since we've done some alternate history. And the channel we're looking at today is one I've never looked at before. They've got about 12,000 subscribers. It's called Videntis. And it showed up in my recommended. So I thought we'd check it out. And as always, I'll put the link in the description below so you can check it out and check out some of his other content as well. Some people ask, well, why do I do alternate history? I thought this was a history channel. Well, one of the reasons I really enjoy a good analysis of alternate history is because it allows us to take a look at what actually happened in a different light by exploring scenarios about what might have happened if things had gone differently, and then we can kind of hyper-analyze certain decisions and certain directions that things went. I think it's a great way to study history and to talk about history, so that's what we're going to do today. This one's What If America Won the War of 1812? Obviously, things could have gone very differently if that war had been decisively won by the United States. Might have changed the balance of power, certainly changes the dynamic in North America moving forward, and maybe the dynamic moving into the 20th century as far as the relationship of the United States to the European powers. So we'll see what he has to say, and I'll share my own thoughts, what I agree with, what I disagree with. Listen, the thing with alternate history is there's no right or wrong answer, right? We can analyze what really happened, but as far as projecting what we think would happen, that's very much about opinions. So I'll be curious to hear yours. What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? Whether it's me or the original content creator. I want to give a shout out and a thank you to Adam in Catawba, North Carolina, and John in Shirley, New York. Thank you guys so much for your support on Patreon. Let's check this one out.
James Madison declared war on Britain on June 18, 1812. The U.S. marched into Canada and assumed it would be an easy victory. Americans expected their Canadian brothers to rise up and throw off the shackles of an evil tyrant.
So this is not an uncommon belief at that time, right? This is a couple of generations after the American Revolution. In the American Revolutionary War, the U.S. had attempted the same thing, to send troops into Canada. The idea had always been, in these early years, that Canada, as a fellow British colony, would eventually join with the United States to form this North American power. It just didn't work out that way. Canadians just saw things differently. Of course, you can see at this time that Upper Canada and Lower Canada more toward what would be today Quebec. A lot of Upper Canada becomes modern-day Ontario. The borders aren't exact. And, of course, Nova Scotia, New Scotland, and New Brunswick up there. A couple of just minor clarifications, and this is just a personal preference. You could say James Madison, who was president of the United States, declared war, but it's really Congress who declares war, though I'm certain James Madison signed off on it. The other thing is, technically, at this point, we're talking about the United Kingdom and not Great Britain. Great Britain being the island that has Scotland, Wales, and England on it. And by this time, they are the United Kingdom. Ireland is a part of this as well.
But that was not the case. They won some battles and lost others.
Yeah.
Britain landed on U.S. soil in 1814 and burned the White House to the ground. Despite this, Britain was pushed back, and neither side gained anything from the war. So, the Treaty of Ghent was signed on December 27, 1814, ending the war. Neither side won, but also neither side lost, so they were kind of satisfied with the result.
Yeah, as it mentioned here, status quo ante bellum, so really nothing changes. I wouldn't say nothing changed. One of the main reasons that compelled the U.S. to go to war in the first place was this idea of impressment of sailors. In other words, they would stop American ships on the seas and pull men that they suspected of being deserters from the British Navy off the ships and basically put them into British service again. And obviously this was a violation of America's sovereignty on the seas in international waters, and so it didn't sit well. And there were other things too. All right.
There were many causes for the war, but it also should be made clear, Madison didn't jump right into this decision. He was not a warmonger. The War of 1812 was really a culmination of frustration against the British. Since the Revolution, they had been treating Americans pretty terribly in trade expeditions abroad in Europe. Britain was kidnapping U.S. sailors, forcing them to join their navy, and go die fighting Napoleon. In 1807, Britain's orders and councils required any American ships to stop in England before they could even trade with other European nations. The Brits put a trade...
Basically what's happening is, and you see a similar thing, the first parallel that automatically comes to mind for me is the aftermath of the American Civil War, how many of the newly freed, formerly enslaved people end up going back to work for the same masters they had once worked for, and they basically sign contracts that enslave them again in all but name. In other words, it was the South trying to keep what they had before the war going after the war, just by kind of finding loopholes around things. And the British, even though they've lost the American Revolution and the U.S. has gained its independence, are still trying in some ways to treat the United States like their colonial power by forcing them into some of these things, like having to stop at British ports before trading with the continent. But you also have to remember that this is happening in part because of the war that's happening in Europe. Remember, the Napoleonic Wars are in the middle of all of that, and Napoleon is trying to enforce his continental system, where he's doing the same to the British, right? He's trying to keep the British from being able to trade with the continent. And so part of this is an extension of the British trying to get back at Napoleon.
Trade blockade around France, which hurt the U.S. economy a lot. England was aiding Tecumseh, an American Indian, with guns and ammunition, and told them, hey, go fight and go kill these American settlers because we don't want them taking this land.
And there's parallels of that in the 20th century, right? You know, the U.S. Funding and equipping the Mujahideen to fight in the Middle East against America's enemies, or America's at least perceived rivals. And so the same thing's happening here. The British are going to get folks who are already on the ground, who are predisposed to be opposed to the United States. It's easier than sending much needed troops that you need against Napoleon over to North America.
There were even rumors that Britain was sabotaging the U.S. tactile industry and illegally damaging U.S. livestock in the Northeast. And on top of all of that, there were many war hawks in the U.S. who were like, you know what, Britain, screw you, we want to go to war. Another thing to remember is that this was not an isolated war. A big reason for why the U.S. declared war was that in 1812, Britain was already preoccupying this other guy called Napoleon. I don't know if you've heard of him. The war was not an easy decision for America, and it barely passed through the Senate. And, as with most things in America at that time, it was a North-South divide. Northern Federalists relied on trade with England, and a war would hurt that. They viewed Napoleon as a narcissistic dictator and a despot, and they opposed the war. Southern Democrat Republicans, I know that sounds funny now, romanticized Napoleon, and he was a peasant fighting against the corrupt aristocracy of the old world.
Yeah, all throughout history, even to this modern day, right, there are political divides between North and South. Now, granted, Pennsylvania and Ohio aren't exactly South, but these are different times. So, I mean, the issues are complicated, as always. I have to remember, too, who's still king in the UK. It's George III, even though by this point they've got a regency, and his son, the Prince Regent, who will become George IV, is kind of running the show. But by this point, it's really Parliament that runs things anyway.
And they were for the war. In order for the U.S. to have had a chance at defeating Britain, a few things would have had to change, as it was very unlikely that America could have won if all the external factors surrounding the war were the same. Remember, wars at this point were not just isolated events taking place on a different continent. Everything had been interconnected with Europe. America was simply not strong enough or prepared enough for the war. Napoleon would have had to be in a better position in Europe. This would make an alliance with him strategically more valuable for the States, and it would mean Britain would have had to pull more troops out of Canada, definitely weakening it.
Yeah, what's happening during the War of 1812? Napoleon's marching on Russia, and that's not ending well for him. His Grande Armée is basically being destroyed.
France would have had to have been seen in a better light. Maybe Napoleon was viewed more favorably because he sold Louisiana to America. Maybe French aid during the American Revolution would have been more celebrated at this point, too. Also, Jefferson would have had to have been more pro-army than he was. He was not in favor of a strong military and served before Madison, but if he encouraged it, things could have gone differently.
Yeah, Jefferson, he's complicated, right? He was definitely very much opposed to the idea of a standing army because he viewed that as something that was tyrannical. And he opposed a strong central government in general, but he also oversaw the largest expansion of American territory in history with the acquisition of the Louisiana Territory. He also oversaw the establishment of West Point as a military academy for the United States to train officers for a standing army. So he's complicated.
In real life, many Americans opposed the standing army after the Revolution, and this was a major factor for the military shortcomings during the real War of 1812, as the U.S. was just not ready. All of these changes could have led to the war being more popular through the country, which in turn would have meant many of the militias in the Northeast who refused to fight would have now fought, giving the Union roughly 60,000 troops. Madison would still declare war on Britain on June 18, 1812, keying off the war. However, instead of attempting to march through Michigan, the U.S. would go through New York into Canada. The reason they didn't in real life is because they wanted to avoid the Federalists there, who opposed the war. General Stephen von Rensselaer defeated the British at the Battle of Queenston Heights on October 13, 1812, and went on to take Fort George.
The Van Rensselaer's obviously a Dutch name, and if you see Dutch names at this time, you can almost guarantee they're coming from the Hudson River Valley over here, because that's where all the Dutch people were. But Van Rensselaer's were some of the most wealthy and influential people in New York at this time, and New York's obviously one of the biggest states, one of the most influential states.
While Henry Dearborn captured Montreal by the end of the year. The English would capture Fort Detroit from American General William Hull under Major General Isaac Brock. After Hull's surrender to the Redcoats.
And Hull's surrender probably goes down in history just below Benedict Arnold in terms of the appalling moments in American military history. There were people who wanted that man hung for treason for that debacle in Detroit. It was a mess.
William Henry Harrison, yes, the future president, took command of the Army of the Northwest. He marched north in January of 1813 to retake Detroit from Colonel Henry Proctor and Tecumseh, who were now working together and held command there. Harrison defeated the British at Frenchtown, which prevented the Potawatomi scalping of American prisoners that happened in real life there. Tecumseh was captured and killed, crippling the American Indian morale. Harrison continued north and retook Detroit from Proctor.
Yeah, so remember, where's the frontier at this point? Even though we've acquired the Louisiana territory, right now, Ohio, at least in the north, is the westernmost state, right? Michigan's not a state yet. Indiana's not a state yet. This was all what was known as the Northwest Territory. In 1787, it was established, Northwest Ordinances. If you grow up in Ohio and probably those other states too, it's something you learn a lot about in history in school. Ohio is the first state to be established from that in March of 1803. The others will come later: Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan. But this really is kind of the frontier at this point. There's a lot of American settlers there, but there's a lot of Native Americans as well.
Bloody conflict that would have cost both sides a ton of lives. Proctor managed to escape back east, though. This effectively put the British on a defensive for the rest of the war in the north.
I want to just comment on the map here and appreciate the attention to detail. Look at this little sliver right here that's kind of its own thing. That's obviously it's part of Ohio today, but kind of disputed territory, and that's where Toledo is. And the joke here in Ohio, and maybe they have it in Michigan too, is that Ohio and Michigan fought a war over Toledo, and Michigan won because Ohio got Toledo.
Von Rensselaer and Commodore Isaac Chauncey attacked York, the old name for Toronto, which was also the capital of Upper Canada, and defeated the British, who fled northward, giving the city up to the Americans.
And the city at that time, I think, is still called York rather than Toronto. And in fact, the burning of Washington, D.C. is in part a retaliation for what the Americans did to York.
The British at Fort Erie abandoned it and escaped north before they were cut off. Chauncey then marched after them and met them at the Battle of Oxford and destroyed them. Over 1,500 Canadians were killed. The defeat caused the Iroquois to change side to the Americans.
So I had to pause there because some of the stuff he was saying, I was like, man, that's not what happened historically, talking about a Battle of Oxford and the numbers of men killed in some of these battles. And I realized that what we're watching is not telling what actually happened in the War of 1812. This is all part of his alternate history. This is, it's early in the morning, I'm not awake yet. I'm not familiar with his channel, so I didn't realize he was telling an entire alternate history of the war before he talks about what happened after the war. So this is a fictional version of the War of 1812.
Captain Oliver Hazard Perry won at the Battle of Lake Erie on September 10, 1813, giving the U.S. control over the lake, and boosted the American morale even more. Harrison then marched into Canada and won at the Battle of Thames on October 5, 1813. Proctor was killed during the battle. Many loyalist Canadians began fleeing east to safety, and some even left to England.
And that's something that happened during the American Revolution, is that many loyalists in the United States, which probably made up as much as 1/3 of the people in the colonies at that time, many of them fled to Canada or to England when the United States won the war.
These American victories prevented the Chesapeake Campaign from taking place, as Britain was now focused on retaking Canada rather than attacking the Americans. Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDougall captured Fort Mackinac on May 18, 1814, and sent many Indian allies to ambush American forces. Brock attacked York but failed to recapture the city and was forced to flee north again. The Indian attack on Fort Mims would still occur, with 400 American civilians, women and children mostly, being horrifically butchered and scalped. This would become a major rallying cry for the Americans against the natives during the war. Andrew Jackson defeated the Red Sticks at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend on March 17th in retaliation.
Yeah, and historically speaking, those forces ended up wiping out nearly 1,000 Native Americans. And Jackson's force included a couple thousand Americans and some Native Americans as well. And this was a pretty common thing at this point, right, on the frontier, which right now the frontier is still east of the Mississippi, even though the United States has acquired all this other land. And there were such retaliations going on back and forth on both sides, but in the end, the Native Americans kind of get the worst of it just because of the superior firepower and manpower that the United States forces are able to bring into these situations.
While this was going on, Harrison marched north and retook Mackinac from the British, and Major Zachary Taylor, another future president, won at the Battle of Credit Island.
So yeah, what we're seeing here is much like the Mexican-American War is to the Civil War, where you have a lot of these guys who are going to become generals during the American Civil War, serving as staff officers or as lieutenants, captains, majors, colonels in the Mexican War. Same thing happens here with the War of 1812. A lot of the guys who are going to rise to prominence in the United States, or even as generals in the American Revolution, are going to be making a name for themselves now. Andrew Jackson, who's going to become president later on. William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor, who's going to become president. You've even got a Brigadier General Winfield Scott in this war, who's going to become the General-in-Chief of American forces for decades,
preventing a Western front for the Redcoats from opening up. At this point, the British defeated Napoleon in Europe, which allowed them to bring more troops in, but Canada had almost already been completely taken, and over 75,000 people had fled back to England. On July 11, 1814, Thomas Masterman Hardy besieged Fort Sullivan but could not conquer the fort quickly as he wanted. At the Battle of Plattsburgh on September 11, 1814, Commandant Thomas MacDonough defeated the British reinforcements under Captain George Downey, who died during the battle, giving America...
He's killing off a lot of these British commanders.
...control over Lake Champlain, preventing another British advance. General Alexander Macomb then attacked north, crushing Lieutenant General Sir George Prevost, who had to retreat east to Halifax. John Cope Sherbrooke led 3,000 British troops from Halifax on the Penobscot expedition.
So what we're seeing here is a major focus of the war happening on the frontier and the border regions between Canada and the United States, which is preventing, for example, the British from sending troops where they're going to win the Battle of Bladensburg, Maryland, historically, which leads to the capture and burning of Washington.
Fort Sullivan in September. Macomb marched east to meet Sherbrooke, and they fought at the Battle of Old Town. The battle was a decisive American victory, and Sherbrooke was killed alongside 2,000 of his men.
The only thing I don't like about his alternate history here are the casualty figures that he is giving for these battles. I can't see a scenario where 2,000 men are killed when the armies very often were 2,000 to 3,000 men in these battles. Historically speaking, the entire 2+ years of the War of 2 years of the War of 1812 results in about 5,000 battle deaths combined, about 2,000 to 2,500 on each side for the entire war. So I don't like the idea of having 2,000 men killed on one side in one battle when that basically equals the entire killed for the war historically.
Upon word of the American victory, Canadians in Nova Scotia fled in droves across the Atlantic. Macomb then marched south and massacred Masterman, lifting the siege of Fort Sullivan, and now Nova Scotia was completely undefended for America. Macomb marched into Nova Scotia, captured British ships and supplies, leaving Brock completely surrounded. Washington would not be burned in August of 1814, and there would be no siege of Fort McHenry, so Francis Scott Key's Star-Spangled Banner would never have been written.
Interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Yeah. So historically, Francis Scott Key, who is like a lawyer, he's on a ship observing the battle for Fort McHenry. McHenry is commanded by Major Armistead, who is the uncle of future Confederate General Lewis Armistead. And that's when he writes the Star-Spangled Banner, which doesn't become the United States national anthem until the 20th century, but was always one of the main patriotic songs that was used in the U.S. even in the 19th century.
What do you guys think the national anthem would have been for this America?
Yankee Doodle? I don't know. Be something else somebody would write.
Still would have attacked New Orleans, as they viewed the Mississippi as being a crucial point for the war.
Now, you better have Pakenham get killed, because he actually did get killed in the War of 1812 at the Battle of New Orleans.
Lord Pakenham went there with 8,000 men. The Battle of New Orleans took place on January 8, 1815, just as in real life. Jackson destroyed the British force before lifting the siege of Fort St. Philip.
Now, I will say this. I have to disagree with the British sending a large force to New Orleans if things are going so badly in Canada. I would think rather than going on the offensive and attacking a major U.S. port, they would have sent those troops to defend or retake Canada and at least try to consolidate their gains, or prevent any gains by the Americans, and try to push it back toward a status quo.
General John Lambert laid siege to Fort Bower on February 12th and captured it, securing Mobile as a base of operations for the British. But Jackson met him at the Battle of Cedar River. The battle was a resounding American victory, and Lambert was killed. At this point, the British were growing impatient and tired of the war. Many of their loyalist populations had already fled from Canada, and more importantly, Napoleon had just reemerged as a major threat because he returned from his exile to Paris.
That's true.
While all of this was going on, the presidential election of 1816 would take place, and Madison was reelected as the people were happy with his leadership and did not want a major change during an active war. He won in a landslide, crushing Rufus King, the Federalist candidate. This would have long-term...
I'm not sure. He says Indiana does not become a state in 1816 because the war's still ongoing. And I kind of understand that, but also understand the United States added new states during the American Civil War, which was ongoing, which is a much bigger war and was an actual civil war between American states. And the U.S. still added states then. So I don't know.
Implications for the U.S., as a precedent of serving 2 terms like Washington would not have existed for future presidents with extreme popularity like Andrew Jackson, and in turn, this would allow them to run for 3 or more terms. The Federalist Party would be crushed and disappear from politics as a result, as many saw them as being unpatriotic for opposing a war that was going so well in the first place. Now let's get into Madison's policy. The main issue during the 3rd term was slavery.
Federalist Party was kind of dead before this anyway. I mean, the last Federalist president to get elected is John Adams. So, I don't know.
This was a perfect time to slide in a deadline on slavery, and Madison would take it. At this point, most American troops were in Canada or defending the coast from the British Navy. Madison just won a landslide victory over the Federalists, and he was seen as a unifying figure for the entire Union.
So Madison won a landslide victory over the Federalists in 1816 anyway, even with the War of 1812 not being a decisive victory for the United States. So you can see here 183 to 34 electoral votes, 16 states to 3. Only states that the United States or that the Federalists are going to take are Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Delaware. It's 68% to 31% in the popular vote. Now, granted, a lot of people couldn't vote at this time. That's why the numbers are so low. But really, I mean, look, the Federalists are done. And by 1820, when James Monroe is elected, you're not even going to have an opposed election. He's going to get 81%. He's going to carry every state. There's really no real opposition to speak of until 1824, when you have two Democratic Republicans running against each other, one being Jacksonian, one being Adams Clay. So really all you have is a dispute between Democratic Republicans because the Federalists are gone and you don't really have a strong alternative at that point.
He was loved by Southerners and Northerners, and his popularity was at an all-time high. Another thing to consider is that none of the Southern states had any men to secede with at the time. All their boys were up north fighting, so they would be in no position to secede. In real life, at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the North and South agreed to push back talks of slavery 20 years and bring up the topic again. But it was pushed back once more in 1807.
So, the Constitution does include a provision that banned any ban of the slave trade for 20 years. And as soon as that 20 years was up, the slave trade was indeed banned, which meant they couldn't import any new enslaved people, right? But that combined with Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin meant that in the early 1800s, the existing enslaved people became very, very valuable commodities because, number one, you couldn't import any new ones. And number two, the cotton gin made the production of cotton a viable option for slave owners. And so now suddenly the people you do already have enslaved become very valuable because the only way that you can have more is to reproduce them, right? So their children will become new commodities for you. I hate the idea of talking about it that way, but that's how they saw it in the South. And so it wasn't slavery itself that ever was seriously being considered to be banned in the early 1800s. They just kept kicking that can down the road, as we know. But the slave trade was banned. And that actually led to, in the aftermath of the War of 1812, some cooperation between the United States and the British Empire because they worked together because the British Empire also banned the slave trade around that same time. So they worked together, the U.S. and British navies worked together in patrolling West African waters to prevent the slave trade.
Madison was against slavery personally, even though he owned slaves during his life, but he did believe in a humanitarian treatment of them. The anti-slavery position is consistent with Madison, as in 1785, he favored a bill of Thomas Jefferson's that called for the gradual abolition of slavery. Madison viewed slavery as a repressive and barbaric practice. In our timeline, he proposed a ban for slavery in 20 years, so he was not making it an immediate issue for the South, but he was also solving the issue.
And, honestly, I don't know if the South would have gone along with this, but in a perfect world, the ideal solution would have been some kind of a gradual emancipation, even a compensated emancipation where slave owners were paid for it. But the problem is, of course, they would have seen that as a long-term, not a viable solution because they still would have been losing the potential that they had in basically free labor. But it would have saved a lot of blood and a lot of money, actually, for the country if we had been able to come up with a solution like that.
This fit his political strategy and was also consistent with presidents at the time by kicking the issue down the road. This ban would not be drastic enough to make the South secede as a war was still going on with England, and he promised them land to expand south after conquering Canada. So there would never be a Missouri Compromise. But it was also made clear that slavery would end in 20 years. Congress would pass Madison's Slave Act of 1817 in June, supposedly ending the issue. And
that's an act that absolutely probably would have needed to come from a Southerner, right, like Madison. Remember, this is a time when the majority of presidents are being elected from Virginia. You have George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe are all Virginians. And I think it would have needed to come from a slave-owning Virginian like Madison.
Now, let's get back to the war. The lack of British troops at Waterloo would have led to a Napoleonic victory there. Napoleon would win a few battles as Britain was not as strong, so Britain pulled a lot of their remaining troops to Europe within the next year. Napoleon then fortified France's position to give himself time to regroup, train more men, and fight on. This opened up the Bahamas to Jackson, who landed there in July and captured all the islands for the U.S.
I can see that situation. I'm not sure if Napoleon would have been in a position of strength enough to hold on. But without a British army, certainly it's possible. And I could see a situation where in that scenario, Napoleon's maybe able to negotiate to hang on to his throne. And maybe France at least keeps its kind of modern borders, not any additional territory, though.
U.S. in 1817. Both sides would be open to negotiations as they received word of recent Napoleonic victories in Europe. America wanted their land, and Britain saw France as a bigger danger than the States. Britain began negotiations with the U.S. under Henry Clay in 1818, when the Treaty of Lisbon was signed. Before word reached America, the last battle of the war took place. Brock met off against Macomb and Harrison at the Battle of McCusco. He was outnumbered 3-1 and died fighting with his men for his nation.
I don't like that he kills off the generals commanding every single one of these battles. Yeah, it probably would have happened a few times, as it happened at New Orleans with the British commander, but not every single time. And I see that he's kind of taking a page out of the real War of 1812, where you had the Battle of New Orleans happen after the treaty had been signed, but word had not yet reached the United States.
He was a loyal servant to the crown till the end. The Treaty of Lisbon saw Britain cede all lands in Canada. Rupert's Land was given to the U.S. alongside the Bahamas, and Britain had to pay the Union $100 million.
I could absolutely see that a decisive American victory in the War of 1812 absolutely means Canada becomes part of the United States. Bahamas, I could see that as well, maybe, but understanding that the U.S. Navy really isn't competitive with the British Navy at this point, so that might be more of a stretch, but I could see a situation where that happens too.
The U.S. granted safe passage to all Canadian loyalists back to England and saw over 100,000 Canadians leave. The Treaty of Adams-Onis would be signed by Clay in 1818, giving U.S. Florida from Spain. Madison would make it clear,
which is pretty close to when the U.S. got Florida from Spain anyway,
to the Europeans, that this was the New World, it was America's world, and they needed to leave. So instead of it being known as Monroe's Doctrine, it would be known as the Madison Doctrine. Canada would not have any states for a few years, until it was populated with Americans.
Well, who was Madison's Secretary of State? Monroe.
Anglified. Americans would move into the new lands and slowly drive away the Canadian spirit. This would happen within a few generations, just as loyalty to the crown had faded in Canada in the 1900s. The idea of Canada would slowly disappear, and they would begin to view themselves as Americans, just as someone today from Portland would view themselves as patriotic and American as someone from New York. The major issue here with this effect, though, would be Quebec. It was a former French colony and very Catholic. Something that, while technically allowed in America, was still discriminated against.
Yeah, but, I mean, those issues exist within Canada to this day, right? The distinction in the language and in the religion and in the culture between Quebec and the other parts of Canada.
America would most likely treat it the same way as they did with Louisiana, by pushing tons of American citizens there and Americanizing it. But they would also build up Montreal to be even larger, as it was critical for the American trade down the Lawrence
Makes
River.
sense.
There probably would be some revolts throughout Canada at first, but as more loyalists went back to England and American support into Canada, they would grow weaker and weaker and peter out by the 1840s.
I was going to say, I wouldn't expect a lot in terms of active rebellion, because I think, much like we saw with the Loyalists in America, there was no real rebellion by Loyalists in America towards the United States after the Revolution. I think a lot of those folks would either leave or just accept it.
The North would be pushing for 7 new states to be added to the Union, while the South could only add 3, so the South would push for more states to balance out power with the North, and in turn push for war with Spain. Even if slavery was supposed to go away in the future, they would want more slave states in the moment, and plenty of other things could still be fought over in Congress and the Senate. The Spanish-American War now would have broken out in 1819, and this would have been super easy for the U.S. Remember, at this point, Spain was definitely on the decline. They'd just been humiliated by Napoleon. Many of their colonies in South America and even Mexico were declaring independence, so Spain was fracturing from within. Macdonald and Chauncey sailed to Cuba and conquered the islands within a few months. Madison would run for a 4th term, as he was popular leading the U.S. through another war with a supposedly major European power, so nobody would have wanted to run against him. By 1821, America controlled Haiti and Puerto Rico. The Treaty of Moscow was signed in 1822 and gave the U.S. control over most of the Caribbean. White plantation owners quickly moved there and set up massive plantations. States like Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee saw tons of people move out to Florida, the Bahamas, Cuba, and Haiti to escape the less strict federal regulations and oversight on slavery.
I was going to say, I could see that situation too, where folks who don't want to accept gradual emancipation could see the lucrative nature of slavery in the Bahamas, where you have sugar plantations, things like that. Slavery was a huge part of the economy down there.
Madison would not run again in 1824, but he would be viewed as arguably America's best president. During his excellent presidency, he defeated two major European powers. He crushed England and got them out of North America and pushed Spain out of the Caribbean. He more than doubled the size of the U.S. and came up with a supposedly good solution for slavery, and was also known as the father of the Constitution, the documents that really bound the country together. Madison and Washington would be viewed similarly to how Caesar and Augustus were viewed by Romans. They were the...
Yeah, and Madison is the father of the Constitution, even in our own timeline, right? So, he was already viewed very highly as far as his leadership, his role as a founding father, his view on government. And I could see a situation where if the U.S. wins a decisive victory in the War of 1812 and is able to expand in ways that otherwise didn't and acquire Canada, he'd absolutely go down in history as like one of our top 5 presidents.
The quintessential gold standard that all future men and presidents should base themselves after. Monroe ran in 1824 and won. He was a perfect man for the job and was excellent at unifying people in real life, and this would be able to ease tensions between the new lands for the Union. He decreased the federal government and stayed out of state politics, which made everyone happy. Under Monroe, the territories that America had just conquered were given statehood as they had enough Americans at this point. The North got Newfoundland, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Madison, Quebec, Cape Breton, and Maine, which had recently just split from Massachusetts, though it's later in this timeline. The South got Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, the Bahamas, Cuba, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico. So both regions gained 7 states, keeping things balanced.
But how much does that matter in a United States without slavery, right? I mean, slavery was the main issue why there was such a need for balance between North and South. Now, granted, if you come up with a gradual abolition plan, there are going to be other issues that arise that divide the states, like tariffs and views on the role of government, things like that. But I don't see the whole concern over balance of power being that big of an issue, because that was really over the issue of slavery.
In real life, the era of good feelings started under Monroe and would still occur here. These people began viewing themselves as Americans and were proud of it. It's impossible to predict future elections really past this point, but I think someone from Monroe's cabinet would win, maybe Richard Rush, the Attorney General under Monroe, and a popular figure.
Typically, at this time in history, your path to the presidency was Secretary of State, right? Thomas Jefferson was the Secretary of State. James Monroe was the Secretary of State. James Buchanan was the Secretary of State. John Quincy Adams. That's like your pathway. Your diplomatic skill tends to put you up for that. This is long before the time where governors or vice presidents tend to be the main one who the main role that projects you into the presidency.
The Democrat-Republican Party would not split during this election, as the issue of whether to support Jackson would not take place. Over time, the Whig Party, under Henry Clay, would become the main rival party, and would probably eventually change its name to something like the Patriot Party to distance themselves from the English Whigs. Popular American war heroes such as Jackson and Macomb would become presidents at some point and see more American expansion.
Yeah.
During the Democrat-Republican control over the government, states would be given more freedom, and the Union would constantly be expanding, following the original Jeffersonian ideas that the party championed in real life. The individual freedom would appease both the Deep South and new Northern states, but it was also made clear to the South slavery would end.
And here's the thing. The issue of Texas, for example, going to war with Mexico, because Mexico breaks away from Spain. And I would expect that would still happen in this timeline, especially with an even more weakened Spain and a stronger United States. But one of the main reasons for going after Texas was to add another slave state. So is there as much of that? Probably, because at this point, the U.S. has got a real taste for manifest destiny. They've expanded all the way into the northern part of North America. I can see a situation where they might even want to try and go after Mexico and really just make all of North America one nation.
This
That's
period
huge,
of
though.
dominance by the Democrat Republicans would be similar to the period after the Civil War, when Republicans had 8 of the 10 presidents up to 1912. The next major issues for the states would have been in 1836 under President Macomb, a northerner from New York. Texas recently won their independence from Mexico and sought to join the Union. Texas never would have allowed slavery because of this, but it still wouldn't have been admitted initially.
But one of the main reasons why Texas fought for independence from Mexico is that Mexico had outlawed slavery. So in a situation where the United States is also abolishing slavery and therefore there's no option to go to a slave-holding South in the United States, do they still rebel?
Americans moving to Texas would have known that slavery was going to be illegal soon, so the practice wouldn't have ever been popularized. It had also now been 20 years since Madison's slavery ban was supposed to be taking effect, and slavery was supposed to be abolished in 1836. However, the Deep South would still utterly refuse to abandon the practice, and slavery would have been, however, less popular, though. States like Kentucky, Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee probably wouldn't have joined these Confederates. Also, the idea of seceding would not have been as popular as they had already agreed 20 years ago to abolition. So,
yeah, it would have been tougher. And states like North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee didn't join the Confederacy until after the war began. So slavery is not as entrenched there. It's not as essential in their minds to the economy as it is in what were called the Cotton States, the Deep South. And with this abolition plan in place, I don't see any chance where I think Virginia probably already has abolished it at this point in this timeline.
It wouldn't have garnered the same support. The idea of states' rights would be very different, as the Democrat Republicans had granted tons of liberties and stayed out of local politics, so putting down their foot over one issue was not viewed as another of many federal overreaches. This version of the Civil War would have been much smaller and probably less deadly. Many states would still secede, but not to the extent in our time. Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Florida, Arkansas, Missouri, the Bahamas.
Missouri didn't even secede in real life, and there's only one S in Louisiana.
Cuba, Haiti, and Puerto Rico probably all would have succeeded. However, the push to preserve the Southern way of life would not be as strong. Instead of the 3% of Southerners who owned slaves in 1860, it would be less than 1%, as the practice had already been waning out. The Confederates would quickly lose war within 2 or 3 years, and in 1840, President Macomb pushed Congress to admit Texas into the Union. When the U.S. added Texas, the Mexican-American War would have broken out just as it did in real life. America would have crushed Mexico, and Macomb probably would have pushed for more land and annexed deeper south, taking all of California.
Yeah, I can
As
see
time
that.
went on, America pushed further west, and eventually reached from sea to shining sea, and would eventually buy Alaska from Russia on March 30th, 1867, uniting
Which it
most
did.
of North America under the Stars and Stripes. The U.S. would be very anti-European in general, but especially towards England. England would be bitter towards America, and they would also always have tension between the two, and they wouldn't have really healed in the late 1800s as they did in real life, because the U.S. had beat them in 2 wars and left them, very mad.
Yeah, but you know what? The U.S. and the British had fought those 2 wars, and yeah, would there have been more resentment between the British and the Americans? Sure, but you know what? The British and French fought for centuries against each other, and as recently as 1815 had fought against each other, and that was a much more bitter contest than anything that would have happened in the War of 1812 or the Revolution. So there's much more animosity between Britain and France, and they still became allies in the First World War. So I don't see any reason why the United States wouldn't still be allies with the British in the 20th century.
The U.S. would be more self-reliant and isolationist, and Europe would become more unimportant to America, as the American economy was really big enough to be self-sufficient. The population for the U.S. would have exploded in the late 1800s, and cities would span all through the nation. Different regions would develop their own characteristics, but as America was so large, trade could have been mostly internal while still spanning almost an entire continent. Despite all that, in 1914, the Great War would still break out, and the U.S. would not have close ties to England, France, or Germany, so they may have followed the Madison Doctrine and set out the war. What do you think would have happened in this World War I? Who do you think the U.S. would have allied with, if anyone? And just remember,
it honestly depends on the ties between nations. It depends on the immigration in that situation. Do you have less English immigration to the United States, and so then even more of the population is German, and therefore the U.S. becomes more pro-German? That's certainly possible.
while the War of 1812 is an afterthought in most history books, if things had gone slightly differently, the world as we know it would look very, very different. The long-term effects of winning in 1812 would be drastic. Comment and let me know you think how history would have changed if America won the War of 1812. I hope.
All right, so let me know your thoughts, and what do you think about any of this? What do you agree with, disagree with? How do you see things differently? What to you would be the point of divergence? In other words, the thing that would have had to change in our timeline in order for the U.S. to have decisively won that war. It's a fun exercise in analyzing history, I think. So check out the original content there in the description below. And I want to give a shout out to Adam in Wellington, New Zealand, and also to Matthew in Chaska, Minnesota. Thank you guys for your support. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.